I love how these two concepts are so closely related, because we can't go on a journey without accepting an invitation to more than we currently have, to more than we find ourselves at. Sometimes we think we've arrived, sometimes we think we're already there. But when we understand Jesus' invitation to us every day, every moment, through every song, through everything that happens, through every word that's spoken to us, when we are aware of his invitations to us to continue on a journey, we must leave something to gain something else. We can't get to somewhere else while still being where we are or where we were. This brings some pain into journey. This brings a release of our control. This brings discomfort to places where we get comfortable where we're at. And every journey, I'm going to move on from journeys because we've left that, but I think there's an interesting connection. Every journey begins with surrender. And today we've got several themes we're going to go through on this invitation series. But today is the invitation to surrender. And we've all sung songs, different songs about surrender like we did today. But I want to try and pick up on what is the foundation of all of these things that we surrender. You know, we've got ideas like, you know, we surrender our wealth, we surrender our lives, we surrender our will, we surrender our hearts. But what is the core thing that we surrender to? And I think the worship team, with Michelle's input on the song choice, leading in perfectly, grasped where I feel we need to go today. Because the surrender comes out of an experience of love. An experience of identity, of understanding who I am means I can surrender. We don't like to use the word surrender. We probably only hear it in church. And the reality is that if we surrender to something that is not perfect, that is not bigger than us, it opens the door to pain and wounding and hurt. But there is one who we can surrender to if we understand that he is love, that that's part of his identity. We shouldn't surrender fully in the way I'm going to talk about to any other person or being or thing. Surrendering to something greater than us is the only thing that can free us from the tyranny of being prisoned in our own ego and will. Of every answer having to come from within me to provide my reason for existence, to provide meaning for my life. It's only through surrendering to something greater that I find true meaning, true life. Everything else, apart from surrender to love, just ends up becoming another self-help scheme, ends up relying on willpower. I'm going to talk a little bit later about obedience and surrender. I think sometimes we get confused with what obedience really means when it is referenced in the scripture. But I think the relationship between these two words is very close, but it's not the same thing. We're going to go into that. And if we don't understand that difference, We can be obedient without ever surrendering. We can be obedient out of duty and obligation without ever surrendering the core of our hearts and our wills. We'll go more into that shortly. But if we don't understand that surrender, our obedience can just become willpower of trying to please God, and it all comes out of our identity of how we see God, ourselves, and others, which might sound familiar if you've seen our new logo that AJ's brought out with our mission statement on it. Everything flows from this. So surrendering to love is my key point today. Someone asked this week, what does it mean to just let go of control? Something Adam mentioned last week. What does it mean to let go? And I found it a struggle to answer, to explain. A little bit like the mustard seed parable. A little bit like all the mysteries of God. The only thing I can sometimes share out of is my own story. There's a sense that we have to experience it. So as we enter this, I just want to quickly, briefly go through a little bit of my story just so it can become something that we can refer to or keep in the back of our heads, because every story is unique. My story is unique, but every story is universal in the sense that there is something that relates to all of us. There'll be central truths to surrender. So for much of my life up until several years ago, I would say that deep down inside, it took me a long time to get aware of this, and I had to get to the end of myself in a new way. But deep down inside me, without even realizing it most of the time, there was a need to please God. There was a need to make him proud. And it was only through God, I believe, raising up some of these deep emotions and desires and things in my heart that I pushed down because of my need to control the outside exterior of my life to be a good Christian. Slowly he began to bring up some of these feelings, some of these desires. And through that unlocked things in my heart that I'd locked away. Because on the outside, I felt like I still had to try and be good enough. It was only when I found myself when I couldn't escape holding that wall up, holding that facade up, that everything fell apart enough. And I got so sick of holding that up that I had to acknowledge who I was, even those parts of me that I didn't like, that I didn't want to see. Through that, I realized that God accepted, not just accepted, but loved all of me, even those parts that I tried to hide, even those parts I was ashamed of. And all I presented was this front of behavior, this front of my actions. And I realized that I was the one that Jesus was referring to when he said, "You Pharisees are a whitewashed tomb." And see, that made it even harder, because when I'd realize some of this stuff and I go, "Oh, but look how gross that is on the inside. Look at how much I do for others out of just wanting to be loved myself. Look at how much I control others because of my need to please, because I want to earn love and people to see me the right way." Look at how people experience me, because I want everything to be so perfect, and I'm so critical on myself that I start being so critical on everyone around me, especially those who matter most to me. It was only when I got so sick and tired of holding that difference and going, but I feel like I'm this, but they're worlds apart. And this word integrity to me, that I always thought to mean doing the right thing, behaving the right way, acting the right way. The definition of integrity, I realized, was actually what's on the inside is the same as what's on the outside. So that I live from the inside of the depth of my being, and that's reflected on the outside. Because then I come to Jesus as I am, not as I pretend to be. And for so much of my life, I realized that out of this place of not being enough, be either disqualifying myself of the way I'd lived or the decisions I'd made, of knowing, being the only one who knows my heart well enough, had thought that if anyone else saw the depths of my heart, they would find me to be unlovable. And so I always had this facade. It was only through getting to the end, getting to a place where I had to admit that I felt trapped by those things that I loved most in my life, trapped in my marriage, trapped in being a parent. And then the shame of actually being honest with that. And then trying to push them away again and going, no, that's the wrong thing. And then them coming up again and then feeling more disconnected and then putting on more of a front and then working harder to be a good person, doubling down my willpower and my attitude and my behavior and my discipline, because I'm a pretty stubborn guy when it comes to getting stuff done. I'm fairly driven. I can ride my mountain bike for 24 hours in a circle and not give up. So why would I give up with this? But then for the first time in my life, after having to be honest with where I found myself, being honest with my wife, but that's not where I wanted to be, but that's how I was feeling. For the first time in my life, I gave up. But for the first time in my life now, I wasn't relying on my willpower, my discipline to achieve something. I'd been holding on tighter and tighter and tighter to this facade. And then suddenly I was so exhausted, I just let go. And after that point, I slowly began to experience his love in that place of honesty, because change only comes through brutal honesty and vulnerability, Jesus seeing me as I am, that I began to experience his love in a way that I hadn't before. Because before I only experienced his love because I was performing for it. I hadn't experienced his love without performing. And so it would just reinforce this cycle of, yep, I've done the right thing. He loves me. I'll keep doing that again. Which is exactly the same as what happened with my earthly dad. It was a reflection of that. And all the time I would think with my earthly dad or with God, oh, but if he really knew me, apart from what I can do and what I can achieve and what I get praised for, pretty sure he wouldn't love me then. And I never gave him the opportunity to love me for who I knew myself to be. I was brought to a place where I had to be vulnerable, to be naked first in my most intimate relationships and God, and learn to live into vulnerability where I can stand now before you and share some of my story. Standing in front of people and talking is one of the biggest fears. And I never would have stepped into something like this before. And even in stepping up here, I've got these things fighting in me, preparing for today. I have to have it all together. I have to have the right slides. What if I jumble the wrong words? What if I make a fool of myself? This old life of needing to earn love keeps wanting to pull me back. And every day I need to surrender the same way I surrendered back then to a love that loves me as I am. So I can learn to love myself as I am, because I can only be transformed after I experience that love. If you don't believe me, read Ephesians 3. We'll get to it later. But while we're there, he says, may you experience the love of Christ, though it's too great to understand fully. Then you will be made complete. And how can we experience love if our love's based only on performance and achieving and presenting the best parts of ourselves to God? How do we then be made complete with all the fullness of life and power that comes from God? Do you feel like you're lacking a little bit of life? Do you feel like you're incomplete? Because I do. But in those moments when I am vulnerable before God, in those moments when I let go and I put my performing down and I step into my fears and leave my controlling, I finally experience more. We said before that surrender is not obedience. They're very, very closely related. And this is how I see obedience. Obedience should grow out of surrender. Surrender provides the true motive for true Christian obedience. Obedience is what God asked for. But we can only be obedient when we surrender. He cares about motive. You might remember lots of verses about the heart, about motive, about the whitewashed tomb, about cleaning the outside of the cup when the inside's dirty. He cares about what's on the inside. Yes, he cares about what we do, but he cares more about why we do it. Everything in the kingdom revolves around this idea that growth, I believe, comes from the inside out. See, obedience without surrender, and this is where it varies, because we can be obedient without surrendering, and I believe obedience without surrender just becomes duty or obligation. But God wants our heart. We can be obedient to a commander in the army who's got authority over us, but we're not going to surrender to him. We don't give him access to the interior of our life. We can be obedient out of fear of punishment. But when we experience perfect love, it casts out all fear. So if we surrender first to love, perfect love, and experience his love, we are made complete, as Paul said. Paul knows a little bit about transformation, given he had to change his name just to show how much he'd been transformed. This is Paul telling us how to be transformed. If there's anything I can tell you from my story, is that you can only be transformed when you present yourself as you are before Jesus. He says, I stand at the door and knock. I'll open the door and I'll come in and eat with anyone who opens the door to me. He sees us. He knows us as we are. So why not invite him into those places? Why would he say, I stand at the door and knock, if it wasn't the fact that we often kept the door to different places in our hearts closed off? The door is not conversion and then the door's wide open. We are complex beings, so much so that St. Teresa of Avila, who wrote a classic on the interior of the heart called The Mansions of the Heart, can't remember what the date was, hundreds of years ago, talks about this mansion with many, many rooms in our growth. I wonder what room he wants to open next, because he's trying to open another room in my heart every day. And the thing is, when we start living out of obedience and we forget about surrender, we close more doors, because it just becomes about behavior management. We make up all of these rules, all these expectations of what a Christian should do. And often, it is what a lot of Christians do, but we can't transform the inside just by pretending to do that on the outside. And a lot of these rules are completely just made up, if you think about it. So, this book, that funny enough, I started reading a couple of weeks ago before I started talking on this, which is also called Surrender to Love. So I completely stole this title and some of the themes and quotes. Is a beautiful book. I recommend you read it. If anything is stirred in you, it's only 100 pages long, and I will lend it to anyone, or you can get a copy as well. It's incredible. Discovering the heart of Christian spirituality. And he says, David G. Benner, ultimately problems in surrender, so us not being willing to surrender, ultimately problems in surrender and obedience are problems of knowing God's love. They are problems, therefore, of the heart, not the will. Surrender, obedience, like we're talking about. Problems of the heart. He says, above all else, guard your heart, for it's the wellspring of life, the beginning of life, where the life comes from. And I don't know if you've realized, but if you look at the beginning and the end of the Bible, there's this theme of water, of the river, this wellspring of life. We'll touch on that in a second. He says in Proverbs, because we also know Jeremiah, the heart is wicked beyond belief. But then the story of the gospel is that he comes and he fulfills the prophecy in Ezekiel 36 that says, and I will give you a new heart. And I will put a new spirit in you. I'll take out your stony, stubborn heart and give you a tender, responsive heart. That's what Jesus did. That's what life resurrected did. That's what this invitation is to live into a new heart. This idea that we can trust our heart is completely foreign for many of us who've grown up the Christian journey only hearing about obedience and duty and obligation. We're not attentive to our heart, our internal desires. Our heart gets locked in the attic, gets locked in the basement, and then we wonder why every now and again it just runs off trying to find life, living these desires out in ways that are not aligned with the kingdom. We find lesser lovers in addiction, in anything it leads us to. We wonder why it runs off trying to find life, because we've blocked off the core of our being, which was planted with desires for life. For the most wild lover that is Jesus and God. Just read Song of Solomon's if you don't believe that he is our lover. When we're not attentive to that, we end up with two lives like I did. Another concept to explain this, we all know the prodigal son story. And from that I learned with the younger son and the older son, and the way the father loves them both the same, is that responsible behavior, my behavior or my actions, does not increase the father's love. And the irresponsible behavior of the younger son does not decrease the father's love either. And I think the thing is, in my life, I would rather settle sometimes for being a hired servant to my Father than the beloved Son. Why? Because it's much easier to obey, to do my duty like the older son, to work my time, to serve the King. I still have a sense of control when I do that. Because I know that I do A, put in my work, plus B, do my time, do the right things, the right behaviours. I get C from the Father. He says, well done, son, or well done, worker. Here's your pay for the week. I like that consistency. I like that known. But he calls us to not just stay there, and he rebukes the older son where he's embracing the younger son in his time of being brutally honest with where he is at. And the son then has a chance to live into being the beloved son because he's actually blown it. And that's the greatest gift that he carries. So he has a chance now to be embraced by the Father who runs to meet him. And he goes, he still loves me for who I am, for anything I've done. And then imagine how dedicated he is now to serving the Father out of a place of belonging and joy overflowing, where he wakes up every morning on the farm, goes, wow, this is part of what I'm living for. This is what I'm called for. This is my calling in life, is to be part of working with my Father in the restoration of all things, in growing the kingdom of this farm. And this all hangs on, you see, these two relationships on how we see God. Remember I said how we see God, how we see ourselves, and how we see each other. We are called as a community. We call ourselves to love God, love others, love ourselves. Because we've realized that we can do the first two. We think we're doing the first two, but until we experience this love of the Father, that we're accepted as we are, how do we ever accept anyone else as they truly are? We can pretend to until they actually become our enemy, till they actually threaten us. And it was interesting too during the week, actually. I was talking to Janelle. Oh, funny timing, just walking in. She was talking about some of the Hindu gods over Nepal. How there's all these different gods, and they're always trying to appease and not offend these gods. And when you think about it, every god in history, there's this sense of appeasing or pleasing. How often do we do exactly the same thing? How often do we treat God as exactly the same as every one of those other gods that wants to be appeased or pleased? How often do we think we need to please God, like the older brother, instead of the younger brother who finds himself at the end and can only come as he is, completely vulnerable in his rags before his Father? That is the invitation of God to each of us. That was the invitation in my story. That is the invitation to us today. He doesn't want us to try and please him. Jonathan Helser, who wrote No Longer Slaves, I'm no longer a slave to fear, I am a child of God, was with his son one day on the golf course, trying to teach his son to tee off. His son got so angry, he started hitting it into the creek and then missing it. And he was just getting so angry, and what is he doing? He doesn't normally get this angry. Son, calm down. What's so wrong? He says, Dad, just want to please you. Just want to make you proud. Jonathan Helser bends down to his son and goes, Son, you pleased me the moment I set eyes on you. And you can never do anything which will make me look at you any different. I delight in you. You are my joy. I am so proud of you. And he steps up to the tee again, takes the club and swings it, smashes it the furthest down the fairway he's ever driven it. That to me is a perfect image of living out of surrender to love, of obedience to his Father out of a place of surrender to his love. I want to give you two images very quickly of surrender, because again, as I said, it's hard to explain this idea of just letting go of everything we know. Jenny said, there's someone wanting something to cling to. I think every single one of us wants something to cling to. And that thing is Jesus. But who do we know Jesus to be? My experience is I had to get to the point that I even let go of everything. My understanding of who Jesus was, whether he was there or not. And for the first time, I wasn't in control by how well I was gripping onto something or how good my doctrine was, or how good my willpower and belief was, or how well I presented myself, or how well I behaved. It wasn't reliant on that because I let go of all of that. And I fell until I was gradually, and am gradually, because it's an ongoing invitation and journey, caught by him. Only then did I realize, it's actually got nothing to do with me. Isn't that awesome? Isn't that amazing to know that it's actually not up to me? That he was proud of me, delighted in me, thought of me in Ephesians 1 before the foundation of the world. You might not think that he delights in you. Try this exercise sometime. Close your eyes and think about God thinking about you. How does he feel when he thinks about you? That will expose how well, not just intellectually, but from the depths of your being, how well you understand his love. Ephesians 3, may you experience the love of Christ, though it's too great to understand. So we can't understand it intellectually with reason, so we must experience it. Then, only once we've experienced it and continue to experience, will we become more and more complete with all the fullness of life. What if the reason we don't grow sometimes, what if the reason we don't experience that life sometimes is because we don't let go? Because we haven't experienced that love on levels. Maybe it begins with just asking Jesus, help me experience your love. And there is so much we can go into of what gets in the way, and agreements and lies and the way we see ourselves and the way we see God. It's a big journey. It's the main part of the journey we do in immersion. But you might have heard of or seen the fish, right? The Christian fish. Ichthus, it's called. That was started early in the Christian movement by the early disciples. And Tertullian, who's a 2nd century church father, called Christ the heavenly fish, and his followers, Christians, little fish. Why am I telling you this? Because I think one of the best examples I've seen that I can relate to myself is learning to float. Seeing surrender is learning to float. And I want you to imagine having enough flotation that you can just lie back or be snorkeling and lie forward and not drown. But maybe you've experienced this where then you lift your head up or you get worried and think you can't float and you're trying to swim. Sometimes life is a battle of trying to swim, trying to beat the current until we finally get so exhausted and tired that we surrender and we find that we float on the water. And we look at the first and the last books of the Bible, we see this river that goes from the throne of God, from the heart of God, from the presence of God. And everywhere along the river, there's life, there's restoration, there's transformation. We see it in Genesis in the garden. We see it in Revelation in the very last chapter. He says, living water will flow from within you. See, Christian writers, early writers, said that we were born and live within the divine waters of the Spirit. The Christian life is learning to be supported by these waters, or learning to be immersed in these waters, which is the love of God. One last picture. Surrender is a seed in the soil. And I think this captures what I was trying to get at with surrender and obedience and how they're so closely related but different. I've got an image there. Love, surrender, and obedience. You might remember there's some verses about the seed falling to the ground, life. Surrender can only grow in an atmosphere of love. Being immersed with the water pitcher or grounded in love, as Paul says, may you be grounded in love, allows us to surrender. It holds us, it brings us to life. And obedience actually just grows out of that. So we don't actually have to try and work hard on obedience. It should just be the fruits that grow out of a continually surrendered and open life. And that surrendering and being open to Him is the one thing I've found in my life that makes the difference. Actually, that's the only thing that I bring to my growth. For so long, I thought it was about how hard I tried, how well I put in different measures, different protective things to help my life be better, keep me from addictions, keep me from battling doubt and anxiety inside. And all the time I realized that by doing that, I was just keeping God further and further away, not letting Him into these places. I'd surrendered my life, given my life to Him, the parts I wanted Him to see, the parts I want all of you people to see. He also wants the parts of me that you don't know about me, that I would rather He not know about me. But that's the place where I find life. May you experience the love of Christ, says Paul, who was radically transformed. Though it's too great to understand. Don't worry about trying to study it. You might know what the love of Christ means, but do you know? When Jesus says, "Get away from me, you never knew me," He's not using the word oida for an intellectual knowing of facts. He's using the word ginosko, which is actually the same word used in Genesis when Adam had sexual relations with Eve. It's an intimacy that is naked, that is vulnerable. It is an intimacy where we know the desires of another's heart, not what we know about him. That's important too. Knowing about him is important. But he wants to be known. How can he be known if we don't let ourselves be known as we are? How can we be known if we stop performing and learn that we are loved outside of that? If we find ourselves being the youngest son, some of us have to get to the end of ourselves and sell our inheritance, waste it away before we come back to the Father to learn what love is, to learn what acceptance really is. Some of us have had to do that. It doesn't have to be that way. So today it's the invitation to surrender our striving, the thing that protects us because we always run from love, of being known so vulnerably. Maybe we need to surrender our masks, that which we use to protect ourselves, because inside we're just all little children who are afraid because we've tried loving before and we've been hurt, we've been abused, we've been taken advantage of, we've been forgotten, we've been abandoned. So why wouldn't it be any different with God? Why wouldn't we have to address that pain in our life so we can learn to love once again and be loved once again? See, yes, we're called to surrender our wealth, to surrender our lives, to surrender our property, to surrender our family, all of that stuff. But what if the hardest thing to surrender to is actually love? Because it's terrifying. Paul Young said that religion, as in the idea of being the older brother where we have to earn our right to be children, is like pornography. In the sense that we're longing after something of an intimacy, but we are the ones in control. Like the older brother, we do A plus B and we expect that we'll get C. We do our duties, we do our service, all great things, all good things. Read our Bible, pray. But we still haven't yielded, surrendered to relationship, which is terrifying because we can only have deep, intimate relationship through vulnerability, and vulnerability means that I give up my control. I'm no longer the one in control. So Jesus, we might not even know that we want to be the one in control. We might not even know that we are fearful of being loved, or even more fearful of being found unlovable if we were to expose who we really are. Jesus, this is an invitation that you give us every day, every hour, to choose to surrender to your love, to build trust in your love, that it doesn't let us down, that it doesn't abandon us, and you choose to take us on a journey where we learn how to be loved as we are, so that we can be transformed by love. So Jesus, help us to leave our masks, our striving, our wounds, our past. Help us to leave our definition of self, of you and others, and surrender that to you. We choose to see you as you really are, as love. You are the definition of love. It's not an attribute, it's who you are. You are love. So even the places in us that struggle to believe this, we yield them to you today. We want to know you as love. We want to experience you as love. In Jesus' name.